Everything is everything. No one was happier than Vonetta and Fern to get off the bus for good. We weren't done traveling, but at least we'd been off the Greyhound. Now that we'd been cooped up on the bus for more than a day, and Vonetta and Fern had long ago worn out their best behavior, I saw that Papa knew best by putting us on the bus in New Jersey instead of in New York City. We couldn't have made it 1 mile farther. Even though the bus transfer from Atlanta to Montgomery would have taken only a few hours, that would have meant a few hours more than we could have stood. It was a miracle Vonetta made it from New Jersey to Atlanta without picking on Fern, and a bigger miracle that Fern's watch still hung from her puny wrist. I was just glad we survived more than a day's worth of riding without a real reason to call home. Mrs. turned out to be right after all. Pa didn't mind me calling collect when we reached Atlanta. He told me what a good job I had done getting my sisters down south safely, and I soaked it in. Neither Pa nor my real mother, Cecil, were long on praise. I do enjoy the few words they sprinkled when I got them. Pa said, "You know Mr. Lucas's truck when you see it." "Yes, Pa," I said. "I know Mr. Lucas's truck when I see it," I repeated back for my sisters. "I know Mr. Lucas's truck too," Vonetta said. "It's blue, Papa," Fern added. "Blue and rusty." I waved my hand to shush them. Still, I couldn't believe Fern remembered the old blue truck. Fern was 5 when we had come down for the funerals. She was smaller than small and sat on my lap back then. Fern and Vonetta played invisible hopscotch next to the luggage while I waited for Big Mom, Mr. Lucas, to drive up in his truck. Mr. Lucas, a widower with no kids, was practically Big Ma's brother. The Charles and Lucas's home had been standing within shouting distance from each other for more than 90 years. Mr. Lucas had always treated Big Ma's mother, Ma Charles, like she was his mother, and took care of things for a great-grandmother, especially when Big Ma had come to stay with us in Brooklyn. We still had to drive to Big Ma's small yellow house that stood on about an acre of land, just off the edge of Prattville property in Ottawa County. I looked forward to seeing the big blue truck. Mr. Lucas was sure to bring us bags of unshelled pecans covered in sugar and salt, and maybe a few ripe peaches. Mr. Lucas and Papa always sang Old Man River and other songs on the porch in the evening. Mr. Lucas could dip his voice low to sing baritone and make us laugh. He welcomed us treats and attention. He was the closest thing to a grandpa we'd ever have. We didn't know Cecil's people, and Grandmother Gaither died the year Uncle Darnell was born, although Big Ma never talked about that. It was the first to see the old Ford truck riding up. Then Vonetta and Fern saw it and stopped in the middle of Fern's hopscotch turn. They began to do their praise dancing, glad that we'd soon see Big Ma and Ma Charles. If Big Ma could have seen them jumping and shouting, "Hallelujah," she would have given them a real reason to jump. But she would have gotten to me first for letting them carry on in public. The old truck bounced in the distance. When it was maybe 100 feet away, approaching slowly, I realized Mr. Lucas wasn't behind the wheel. The girls must have realized it also because they stopped praise dancing, Fern reacting to Vonetta, whose face stiffened with recognition. The truck came to an abrupt halt and lurched forward all at once. Uncle Darnell got out of the truck and came around. He stood with both hands on his hips and waited. He looked down before he looked up, but then he came toward us. I knew Vonetta was still angry over what he had done to us, but I missed him. Maybe even more than when he'd been fighting in Vietnam. I knew he'd made us cry and made Big Ma cry and worry and made Pa hate him, but he was my uncle, and I had given up hurting from what he had done to us a long time ago. He was my uncle, and I couldn't stop running until I was hugging him. Vonetta's hurt hadn't dried up, and she hadn't forgotten a thing. She couldn't let go because she didn't get it. She couldn't see how a family was scattering piece by piece. She only cared that Uncle Darnell had stolen our concert money last year and ruined our chance to see the Jackson 5 at Madison Square Garden. It didn't matter to her that our uncle had gone to the army hospital to get himself cleaned up and off drugs. You'd have thought she was Fern when she set eyes on Uncle Darnell, clenching her fists and banging them at her sides, ready to fight. Vonetta marched up to Uncle Darnell, took one of her fists and reared back the way the puncher shouldn't if she didn't want to be the punchee. Then she gave a war cry before letting him have it in the gut. She had been saving that up for months. I knew a look of pity and shame when I saw one. He took her punch and said gently, Vonetta, I hate you, you junkie, you thief. Fern gasped aloud. Her natural instinct was to follow Vonetta, but this time she wouldn't. She loved Michael Jackson, but she loved Uncle D more, and she clamped herself around him in a hug. That left Vonetta outside of our hug, and she seemed happy to not be a part of us. You hate me? Uncle D asked her. Still? After all, he had sent us the Jackson 5 album by special delivery to make up for stealing from us. Vonetta showed her teeth like an animal. I hate you, she breathed short and heavy. I hate you. So you're not going to ride up front with me? He asked. Vonetta crossed her arms. Not for a sack full of candy. Fern looked at her like she was crazy. All right, in the back, Vonetta said. Oh, in the truck part? Where it's nice and bumpity bumpy? Me too, Fern cried. There's a huge bag of chicken feed back there to rest against, Uncle D said. So Vonetta said. She hadn't uncrossed her arms. Wait, if Uncle D was hurt by Vonetta, he didn't show it. He lifted our luggage into the truck bed, then took a blanket from the front seat, shook it, and spread it down next to the luggage. He lifted Fern up and into the truck. He went to lift Vonetta, but she said, I can climb. I don't need your help. But she couldn't climb, and Uncle heaved her up into the truck bed next to Fern. No standing, no horsing around. His voice changed. He was serious. We can wave at all the people we pass, right, Uncle Darnell? You bet. I think he waited for Vonetta to add her 2 cents, the way she normally would if Fern beat her the first line. Vonetta stayed mum, arms crossed, chin pressed to her chest. And he and I got into the cab and we were off. Uncle D was different, older. He wasn't 21 yet, but he wasn't the way he used to be, singing, dancing, telling us stories about princesses in the tower, about the Arabian Night of Herkimer Street. The war had made him older, and the drugs. I didn't know if people could be fixed. The way they showed it in the health films, commercials, and episodes on crime stories, drug turned you into something or someone else. Like in Old Yeller. Old Yeller was a good family dog who'd gotten bit by a rabid wolf while protecting the family. Then became a mad dog foaming at the mouth, and the only thing left to do was to shoot him. When Uncle D came home from Vietnam, he became like a ghost, rattling his chin and moaning in the night. Then Pa said he had to leave our house. I glanced at my uncle, who knew I was staring at him, knew it, but kept his eyes straight on the road. Uncle D, ask me what you want to ask. You're a grown man, right? Grown enough. He squinted against the sun and tilted his head my way. Go ahead, Delphine, ask. Are you all right? He knew what I was asking. Were the drugs gone for good? Did he sleep and moan all the time? Did his sniffling go away? And the hollering out in the night? Was that gone too? Mostly. Mostly? Mostly wasn't enough for me, or what I wanted to hear. He said, I did a lot of healing in the Army hospital, Delphine. Some on the way down here. But you're better, right? His eyes went from the road to me and back to the road. Even though I loved him, I had been hurt by him. Underneath it all, I was unsure, and Fern was probably a little frightened. But only Vonetta was mad enough to stay mad. I asked him again if he was better. I had to tell my sisters to not be afraid and to not be mad. I had to tell them that it was all right, that he was all right. Mostly. His voice was flat and old like Pa's. That's all I can give you. I drove for a little less than 3 hours. I dozed off, but for how long, I didn't know. When I awoke, the Georgia pine trees had become Alabama pine. I knew we were getting closer, as every other town name had creek in it. We passed this creek town only to enter that creek town. The memories of driving past trees, ponds, lakes, creeks, and rivers flooded back to me from the last time we had driven down 3 years ago. Ponds and lakes were in Georgia, rivers and creeks in Alabama. What did it matter? We were far from Brooklyn. Then Uncle Darnell began to sing Stevie Wonder's Uptight, Everything's All Right, but he jumbled the words and sang, Everything is Everything. That's how I knew my old Uncle D was still in there.